Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos todos. Welcome to our speaker series for the spring of 2024. We are waiting so that the participants start coming into our virtual room in Zoom. So we'll be waiting for a little bit before we start the seminar. In the meantime, I want to welcome you all. Bienvenidos todos. My name is David Ortiz. I am the faculty fellow for the Center for Latin American and Border Studies CLABS. Bienvenidos todos. Yo soy David Ortiz. Soy el fellow del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos y de la Frontera aquí en MSU. We are very, very happy that you're joining us, and we want to welcome you to our Spring 2024 speaker series. As I've said, please grab a little bit of a coffee, get situated if you are in your office, get comfortable if you are somewhere else. Please feel comfortable enough. We're trying to get everyone in the Zoom room to sign in, and then we will begin our seminar. While we wait, I wanted to say a couple of things. One of them is that if you see in our chat, if you open our chat right now, you will be able to see our social media accounts. If you want to know the rest of our speakers for the series for the spring, you can see them there, and you can follow us, and you'll always be updated on what's happening and what events we are putting together here at CLABS. So our social media accounts in all of them are up there. So if you're interested, please follow us. One last thing I wanted to tell you is our next speaker will be Dr. Jeremy Slack, and he will be both coming to campus and virtual. So that will be our next speaker. Okay, now that people have chimed in and are in the Zoom room, let me begin. Again, bienvenidos. I would like all of us to give a warm welcome to Dr. Jimena Velasco Huachaya. Jimena, if you're there, please, you can turn on your camera. I'll do a brief presentation of you and your work, but I wanted to welcome you to our CLABS 2024 Spring Series. You're our first speaker for the spring, so welcome. So I'm going to read a little bit about Dr. Velasco Huachaya's bio. Dr. Jimena Velasco Huachaya is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. Her research investigates the institutional sources of protest participation and protest demands. Beyond protests, she also studies attitudes towards democracy in Latin America. She has publications at Comparative Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, Perspective on Politics, Journal of Democracy, World Development, among others. So without further ado, I will leave you all with Dr. Jimena Velasco Huachaya, who has been very gracious to us and accepted our invitation to our speaker series. Jimena.
Thank you, everybody. Should I share my screen now? Is this the right time?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. Just making sure that. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you to CLABS for the invitation, and thank you all of you for taking the time to be here this evening, this afternoon in New Mexico. As David mentioned, I'm Jimena Velasco. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. And I'm going to be sharing with you a project that is very much work in progress. I will show you some preliminary results, but we're very much in the stage of playing with the ideas in terms of explanations and the framing for what we have found in terms of the preliminary findings. And this is a work that I'm working together with Dr. Carew Boulding and Gustavo Perez, both at the University of Colorado Boulder. So questions, comments, please feel free to ask those. Those are going to be very useful at this stage. So without further ado, let me start by taking you back to Latin America in the late 1990s, early 2000s. For those of you familiar with this time period, you might remember the wave of protests that the region witnessed during this time. Here we are focusing in this project not so much about small, localized, isolated protests. We are gearing our attention to mass collective mobilization. And so this was a period of time where many Latin Americans across countries in the region came out to the streets to make demands to the state. And a couple of things, characteristics about this wave of protests that serves as motivator for us in this project. The first one is that this wave of protests was a direct response to neoliberal economic policies that were implemented by the World Bank, the IMF, together with domestic governments at this time. This was a portfolio of economic policies, one of which was the privatization of state-owned companies. One of the main consequences of privatization was massive layoffs that increased unemployment and the privatization of public service provision. Here, a study or an example that has been well studied is the water wars in Bolivia, where indigenous communities who had previously had access to water for free suddenly saw an increase of 100% when privatization took place in the country. So these neoliberal economic policies created a number of social dislocations that materialized in massive mobilizations. The second characteristic of these demands or this protest is the nature of their demands. Because these were our response to the economic policies, the demands at the core of these mobilizations were economic. The people were asking for better standards of living. They were complaining against unemployment and the provision of public services. So these two things for us are very important in terms of contextualizing this wave of protest. Many of these became massive, and the result for several was violence. The state repressed many, and protesters responded also with violence. This led many deaths in many of these countries. So this context of political instability, where we see major protests, state repression, initiated this literature in political science and in other disciplines about the relationship between protesters, and political institutions, in this case, democratic political institutions. Here we draw a lot from Booth and Seligson in 2009, and the question was, what was the role of protest, and were protesters at odds with political institutions? The findings from this literature showed us that protest is not at odds with democracy, that protest can coexist and it is healthy, it's a good component for democratic political participation. And that protesters, even though they might be dissatisfied at specific policies and specific administrations, this dissatisfaction and these grievances don't necessarily translate to dissatisfaction towards the political institutions as a whole. So that was the big finding that we have from this literature, and it serves as a big motivator for us to kind of reassess and ask this question once more. Let's think now about Latin America in the last few years. The last wave of protests, and just for illustrative purposes here, is to think back about the protests that started in several countries in the late 2018, in many countries in 2019, and some of them continue even during the pandemic in 2020. Again, this wave of protest characterized by massive mobilizations, in this instance, not just in countries that are more traditionally known for protesting, like Argentina and Bolivia, but also countries that we don't necessarily associate protest as a regular form of political participation, like Chile and Colombia, to mention just a few. Now, we identified a couple of differences between previous wave of protest and the more recent ones. The first one is that economic demands, while they continue to play an important role in many of these protests and massive mobilization, is not the only thing that people are starting to really ask from governments. Unemployment, better standards of living, increases in wages, the provision of public services are part of the agenda. We certainly don't expect them really to go away anytime soon. But protesters have also started to ask for more things into the political arena. For example, for the expansion of rights, and in countries where rights have been granted, for the respect of these rights. People protest against human rights violations, for example, and a set of bigger claims. Some of these claims even ask for the reforms of the political systems themselves that we didn't necessarily observe in previous waves. So one big difference for us is this diversification of demands made in massive collective action. The second thing that we see today that we didn't see as much before is this increasing dissatisfaction with democratic political systems. Now, this is not unique to Latin America. In fact, there is a growing literature trying to address the factors that are leading people worldwide to be very dissatisfied with democratic political systems across the world. But for us, these two trends, this diversification of demands, people asking more of their governments, not just in the economic arena, but also very much in the political sphere, and this growing dissatisfaction with democracy, is what motivated us to ask this question again. What is the relationship between protesters, and support for the political system? Is Booth and Seligson still correct today that protesters are not as dissatisfied and not at odds with political institutions at large? So what we do is first look at some descriptive evidence. We want to know what protesters' attitudes towards the political system are vis-a-vis their non-participating counterparts. And this is some data that we use for the entire project, but I'm just gonna show you a snapshot. This is from the Latin American Public Opinion Project dataset. This is a biannual survey. This is the data that we use. And this is some descriptive data that shows you on the x-axis, it's the different years for which we have data. And on the y-axis, which I should remember to label after this, is an index for support for the political system. I'll explain a little bit more what we did with this variable. But for now, this goes from 1, not support at all, to 7, very supportive of the political system. So at least descriptively, when we first establish this question, we find first that protesters have not always been as dissatisfied with the political system. This kind of lends some credence to what Booth and Seligson did in their study. However, we have found, again, at least descriptively, that satisfaction with political institutions and with the political regime has been consistently decreasing for both people who protest and for people who doesn't protest, again, showing some credence to this literature, showing that dissatisfaction with political institutions is a phenomenon not just in the region, but worldwide. So for us, this is different, that protesters are more dissatisfied with the political system, that are more at odds with it. It's different from previous findings that painted protesters as dissatisfied, but not necessarily so much so that we would be concerned about this. Now, we see that as different. What hasn't changed, however, is that protesters remain a very active subset of the population. And this serves for us as a motivator for studying this population. In previous studies, it is well documented in the literature that protesters are not apathetic to politics. It's not that they choose to protest and abandon all other means of political participation. Quite on the contrary, they are very, very active in protest as well as other more institutionalized forms of political participation. What you can see here is we divided, and this is from the last 5 years, we divided the sample between people who have reported protesting versus those who have reported not doing so. And we put up the percentages by country of people who also reported participating in elections. In most countries, people who have protested have also participated in greater numbers in elections than people who didn't protest. And again, this is showing this persistent trend that protesters are not apathetic citizens. They don't abandon politics only for the streets, that they engage in several forms of political participation. And for us, this means that they are a very representative sample of the active citizenry. Now, the primary research question that we started this project with is how do citizens or attitudes of people who participated in protest compare to attitudes of those who haven't participated in protest? And we are going to start testing the descriptive data to see if we can actually find that this is the case when we control for other variables. And let me introduce the data set that we use for this and for the rest of the models. Again, this is the Latin American Public Opinion Project. The data that we use goes from 2006 to 2019. As of now, we're actually working on updating the data that we have because LAPOP now has data released for 2023. So we want to add that sample to our current data as well. Now, what you have below is a description of the questions that are included in our index of political support. Now, what is important to understand here is that we're not necessarily interested in support for specific policies or specific administrations. We are interested in diffuse support for the political system. What this means is support for the political institutions and the regime itself. For us, it's very important to differentiate between dissatisfaction with just a policy that may not threaten support for the political regime versus dissatisfaction with the functioning of political institutions themselves. For us, when citizens are dissatisfied with the political institutions that represents them, that's where we need to be a little bit more concerned about topics like political instability, for example. So this is an index constructed from 5 questions. This index was first introduced by Mueller and Hukam in 1977, later developed further by Booth and Seligson, and this is the legitimacy / support measure that has been used ever since. So we continue with this measure also to make a comparison with previous studies. The questions that are included in this index is the extent to which the respondent thinks that the justice tribunals in the country guarantee fair trial, respect for political institutions in the country, whether or not the respondent thinks that citizens' basic rights are well protected by the political system, if the respondent feels proud for living under the country's political system, and if one should support the political system. Again, these are the questions included in the index meant to measure diffuse support for the political regime and the political institutions. Our variable of interest, independent variable, is whether or not people have protested. Here, we are trying to come up with novel ways of measuring these, but for now, this is what we have. LAPOP asks surveys whether or not they have participated in a protest or demonstration in the last 12 months. So this is a binary measure, 0, 1 for yes or no. And we control for a number of variables here: age, education, gender, wealth, interest in politics, all of which have been theorized to increase or decrease support for the political system. And our first set of models is control regressions with fixed effects to control for any other variables that may play a role. Now, this is some evidence that, again, strengthens what we observe in the descriptives that I've showed you. And it's not necessarily a very surprising evidence. What we are seeing right now, and these are regressions by country, but we have a regional model at the end, is that people who protested are significantly less satisfied with the political system than their non-protesting counterparts. Again, this is not necessarily surprising. People protest because they are dissatisfied. This could be specific policies and administration, but they're also dissatisfied with the political system. Now, a couple of things that we are starting to delve a little bit more in the project is the country variations. Because while it is true that the relationship is consistently negative across countries, there is important variation in the region itself. For instance, we have cases like Argentina, Uruguay and Bolivia, where protest is negatively related. Having protested is negatively related to support for the political system, but this relationship is not statistically significant. It's not a significant predictor for decreasing support for the political system. Our first intuition here, and again, is something that we're still working, especially in cases like Bolivia and Argentina, is that protest has become an important part of the repertoire of political action. For those of you who may have been to Bolivia or Argentina at some point, you've probably seen a protest. These are smaller to larger demonstration that happens across capital cities. So our intuition here is that in some countries where there is no significant relationship, it might have to be with how normalized protest is in these countries. And again, Bolivia and Argentina are the two countries where protest participation is the largest in the region. And we're thinking about a little bit about the Uruguayan case and why we don't think that the dynamics are the same. I think something else is playing in that country, and we are thinking about that. But the first set of models and evidence that we have is that, yes, protesters are less satisfied with the political system than non-protesters. Not necessarily very surprising. What we do next, however, is try to understand if this relationship has changed across time. Again, this is what served us as motivator for this project. Do we find the same things that Booth and Seligson and Norris and collaborators found in previous waves of protest? And the findings here, you have the regressions by year, show first further evidence of what these authors found in the 2000s. Here you can see that the relationship between having protested and support for the political system, again, is negative. But in 2006 and 2008, this relationship is not statistically significant. However, and if you look at the coefficient, support for the political system has been consistently decreasing. Again, looking at and thinking back at our descriptive evidence early on. And this decrease in support becomes larger and is now statistically significant across years. So for us, this is an important first finding, that whereas before this relationship was smaller in terms of substance, if we look at 2008 and 2006, again, we can see that the coefficient was less than 0.1. However, if we go now to more contemporary times, 2018, 2016, this coefficient has now moved quite substantively. So that is one first finding. Citizens that have protested are substantially more dissatisfied with the political system, and this dissatisfaction has been increasing with time. The next question for us in this project, and this is where we're trying to put on more work and thinking, is what has changed? What is shaping these attitudes from going to very supportive or not as dissatisfied to far more dissatisfied protesters? What is shaping these attitudes? And where we are at the moment is in thinking about the role of prolonged executive mandates, meaning where a political party of the president has been in power for long periods of time. Now, in the region, there have been two things happening. Certainly, the discussion of long mandates in Latin America is not necessarily new, but we are seeing governments that have remained in power for very long periods, democratically elected governments that have been in power for long periods of time. And at the same time, we're seeing this trend with respect of term limits. Now, we're not putting them together yet in this first project. We're first focusing on prolonged executive mandates, but to give you an illustration of the dynamics in the region that have been unfolding in countries like Bolivia, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, term limits have been successfully eliminated, although the discussion is back in the table in Bolivia, but until just recently, this was a successful case of the elimination of term limits. In some countries like Ecuador and Peru, term limits have been removed and later reinstated. And even in countries like Argentina and Colombia, term limits has been challenged. They haven't been eliminated, but at some point there has been a discussion about the role of term limits. Now, we think that these two things somewhat come together, having parties that have remained in power for very long periods of time, and then governments that are trying to get rid of term limits. Again, term limits as this mechanism of accountability that citizens have to get rid of countries, or excuse me, of politicians that may not necessarily best represent their interests. But for now, let's just focus on prolonged executive mandates and why we think this might be one thing that has changed, that has an influence on how protesters see and evaluate the political system in which they live. For us, long periods of time send important signals to citizens. For one is the absence of alternations of power. Lack of alternations of power may be a larger signal for lack of electoral competition. Again, here we're being a little bit careful in putting all Latin American countries into the same bag. One of the implications that we are going to see later with this project is actually the interaction between executive length in office and term limits. But long executive mandates, we theorize, send a strong signal about lack of alternations of power and perhaps put at risk and threaten the credibility of political competition in terms of elections. The second thing we think really sends a signal to protesters is that if there is no change in power and it is the same political party that has been unresponsive to protesters' demands and interests, but the same political party remains in power, then this sends a signals to protesters that their demands may potentially continue to be unmet and their interests continue to be unrepresented. So that is another mechanism that we think influences this relationship. Within the camp of democratic theory, the lack of alternations of power, of course, mean that losers remain on the losing side for long periods of time. Now, one of the mechanisms of elections is the mechanisms of uncertainty and competition that are provided by competition. And uncertainty, more than anything, provides losers of an election the, say, hope that even if they lose one election, they might win in the next one. So they don't necessarily have to be losers of the electoral game always. However, in contexts where the same political party has remained in power through election for long periods of time, we think that it's going to affect the way in which losers lose elections. It's not that they are losing once, but they are continuously losing the elections. And again, if these are people who have protested and have grievances against the government, this comes together with the thoughts that their demands might remain unmet. Finally, there is a strand of literature that shows us that alternations of power increase support and commitment to the political system and to democratic political systems. So if that is the expectation and the finding, then we would expect that lack of alternation of power or long periods of time in office would have the opposite effect, lowering satisfaction with the political system. From that, we have two hypotheses. The first, I've already shown you some evidence in support of this hypothesis, that protest participants are less supportive of the political system than non-participants. And the one that we're interested in testing now is that prolonged executive party tenure deepens protesters' dissatisfaction with the political system. And again, this part is important in terms of we're not really arguing that prolonged party tenure makes protesters dissatisfied. The literature we have corroborated that protesters are already less dissatisfied. For us, what is important is that it deepens this dissatisfaction, this increases it. And these can have implications for political stability and other factors. So to test this hypothesis, we resort to the same Latin American Public Opinion Project, same measure of legitimacy that I've shown you. The only thing that we add to these models is a country-level measure of executive time in office. This is a count variable, and this is coming from the database of political institutions. It records a count of the number of years that the same political party in the executive has remained in the presidential palace. We also include a number of controls to account for any other alternative explanations. And the modeling technique that we use here is mixed effects multi-level models to account for the nested nature of our data, since surveys are being nested now with country-level indicators, in this case, the count for party tenure. And here, let me show you the preliminary results. This is where we need to do a little bit more work, but what we have gives us some credence to our thinking in terms of the length of the length of time of an executive party and its influence of satisfaction of democracy for protesters. Here, once again, the evidence shows that protesters are less satisfied with the political system. And this doesn't include the interaction yet. We want to test what the differences are when we don't include the interaction. But here you can also see in the second line that the longer a party has remained in the executive, the more dissatisfied protesters are vis-a-vis their non-protester counterparts. And this relationship is statistically significant. Now, I'm going to show you the average marginal effects for the interaction term. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, here it is. So in the y-axis, in the x-axis here, you can see the executive party tenure. In the data set that we have, the longest a party has remained in power, I think it's 22 years. And I need to double check that. And in the y-axis, of course, is our measure of support for the political system. And we have some suggestive evidence of the mechanism or of the hypothesis that we are testing. The longer a political party has remained in power, the more dissatisfied protesters become. And this is statistically significantly different from non-protesting citizens. So that the line that you are seeing there represents protesters. And so when a political party is only just starting, say, their first term, so from 0 to 5, there is a decrease in satisfaction with democracy, but it's not very pronounced. And again, this shouldn't be surprising. Usually political parties that are new administrations enjoy this honeymoon, if I'm correct in the English term, this honeymoon period. However, the longer that same political party remains in office, protesters become substantively more dissatisfied with the political institutions as a whole, not just the administration, not just that political or any one specific public policy, but the political institutions and the regime as a whole. Now, this is some evidence. There are a couple of things. So let me rephrase the findings that we have so far. One is that protest participants, again, are less supportive than their non-participant counterparts, and that longer party tenures are associated with decreased support for the political system. This is true. By the way, I don't think I have the graph here, but I'm happy to share it if anybody's interested. This is true for both. Protest participants and non-participants are dissatisfied with the political system the longer a party remains in office. But this effect is far more pronounced for protest participants. So a couple of things that we are considering and we are doing in terms of moving forward with this project. And it's really thinking about the relationship between party tenure and term limits as an indicator of democratic backsliding. Now, one of the recurrent comments that we get and something that we've been thinking about is that long times in office may not necessarily on their own signal that there is something bad going on with the political institutions and with the regime. The country that comes up to mind here is Uruguay, where the political party has remained in office for quite a long time, but dissatisfaction with democracy or political institutions in Uruguay is not as concerning as in other countries. So it might very well be the case, and this is the direction we are taking, that long party tenures are problematic and send the signals that we are theorizing in countries that have effectively threatened term limits, because it is this taking out of this accountability measure that is sending the signal to citizens that they may not have this competition or real competition in elections, and hence their demands and interests may not be represented because there are no alternatives. So this is the next step for us, thinking about term limits and their interactive role with party tenure. Another alternative explanation that we really need to think about and are considering is how much of this is the democratic backsliding literature that is, again, growing in political science. How much of this is just lack of political renewal? And here, one country that comes to mind is Brazil, for instance, and even Argentina, where these anti-establishment candidates had won elections, and in part of the theorizing and the explanation there is that individuals are tired of traditional politics, of traditional political parties, and that traditional political parties, even if they're not engaging, say, in the dismantling of democratic political institutions, have lost this connection to the citizenry, and they're not necessarily representative to their interests and are not looking out to meeting protesters' demands. So this is something that we're really playing around, trying to understand how much of this is term limits and this backsliding component happening in some of the countries in the region, and how much of this is just lack of political renewal, and how these two different explanations might play a role in terms of evaluations of the political systems from protesters. The other thing that we want to do, and it has been a little bit of a nightmare in terms of data collection for us, is try to understand and zoom in into the dynamics of protesters themselves. Because one of the big limitations that we have in this data, and in fact, I would say an important limitation in the protest literature, is that we take protesters as a homogeneous group, as though everyone have the same interests, the same background, as though it's a really coordinated, homogeneous group of people who are protesting. However, we've seen the rise of protests that are anti-government together with protests that are supportive of the government. And I would say that this is also an important difference from protest before to protest now. It was much easier before to draw a line between this is el pueblo, people, versus the state in dynamics of protest. Certainly, the literature in political science and sociology painted that visible divide, protesters, the people against the state. However, in the last 5-10 years, and here the examples come from countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and more recently Peru, where we are seeing groups of protesters who are the traditional anti-government protesters being met by counter-protests of government supporters. So in light of this, we can't really assume that all protesters are the same or that they want the same demands, and it would be wrong to assume that they might evaluate the political system equally. So one of the efforts that we're trying to do right now, and is together with trying to collect survey data from protesters themselves, because again, one of the limitations in our data right now is that we are relying on this survey question that asks protest people if they protested in the last 12 months, but that hides a lot of variation within that question. So we want to conduct a nationally representative survey in 4 countries specific to people who have protested. Most of the literature right now zooming into protesters is qualitative, and we're trying to come up with a nationally representative survey so we can make more generalizable statements about protesters. And hopefully that also sheds some light into these pro and anti-government protesters and the political context dynamics that are playing at the heart of this thing. So these are the things that we're doing moving forward. But what I presented to you right now, it's kind of the launching path to this project and what we're doing right now. So hopefully I didn't go too fast. I don't know what time is it. Maybe I did go a little bit too fast. But I am happy to talk about questions, comments that you guys may have. Do I keep my presentation up, or should I go back to the?
You can do whatever you desire. You can take it off if you want so that we can see each other better. And then if you want to refer back to it, we can do that too. Okay. But thank you. Thank you, Dr. Velasco. This is fascinating. Of course, this is also my field. So I find all of this fascinating. So we, for the participants in our Zoom, we have a Q&A button on your Zoom where you can actually ask questions to Dr. Velasco Wachaya if you want. We already received some, but if you want to ask questions and at any moment, please use the Q&A button and we will be happy to pose those questions to Dr. Velasco Wachaya, sorry. Okay, so let me start with some of the questions that have already been posed. And I have one myself, of course, too. But the first question that has been posed is by Kai McKinney. And this has to do with some of the issues that you're talking about, although you might not be able to answer it. I'm not sure. Their question is, what are the implications of the legitimacy of a political system when protest methods have escalated to self-immolation while the government response remains unchanged?
I started thinking about how can I test this, and this is like my quantitative side of things. Well, I can speak a little bit to what we know from the literature in terms of the escalation of protest and what this means, especially what it signals to the rest of the citizenry. And this doesn't, I mean, self-immolation is a very extreme form of escalation of protest. But I can certainly think of other forms like shooting protesters. And certainly this seems to be, sadly, this is not something that governments have taken out of their repertoire of repression. We have seen this certainly in the waves of protest in the early 2000s. We've also seen this in the more recent wave of protest in 2019 and 20. If the movement is really large and the government represses, it usually escalates. There is a literature that tells us that this can very well backfire against the government because it further legitimizes the demands of protesters. Moreover, and this is coming from the mobilization resource literature, protesters can in fact use this as a framing mechanism to include human rights abuses from the parts of the government and further legitimize their claims. So on one hand, this can work very badly for the government as it legitimizes protesters' demands. And at the same time, it decreases the level of legitimacy that citizens give to the institution. Now, the nuance here, I would say, depends on the kind of protest or movement that happens, because there is some evidence that shows that some citizens may actually, for instance, support government repression. So here again, I'm thinking about the heterogeneity of protests, and there is a big heterogeneity there. So I don't know how self-immolation necessarily would translate into legitimacy. I don't think I can answer that question like with a certain answer. But at least we know that if the government represses and the repression is coming from the government, it can backfire, it can further legitimize demands from protesters. Now, if it is the protester, him or herself, who are inflicting the violence, my guess is that it can actually, depending on how it's framed, it might actually serve to legitimize, but it really depends on what the demands of the protesters are and the context of the protest and the mobilization is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, there is a very developed literature on the backlash or the backfire of protests. So here's another question that someone has asked in the Q&A, and this is by Dr. Neil Harvey. He says, thank you for your insightful presentation. Do you think a smaller comparison of countries that have seen prolonged executive mandates could be useful by taking into account the extent to which executive rules over or are to some extent checked by the power of the legislative branch and the degree of independence of the judiciary, so that the attitudes of protesters may be directed against hyper-presidentialism and the corruption that can come with that? Are there countries where prolonged executive mandates does not always mean a subordination of destruction of the other branches?
This is a great question, and this is one question that we've been certainly thinking about. To answer from back to front, yes, Uruguay is our one case right now for a country where the same political party has remained, but this has not meant that there is a compromise of accountability across the other branches of government. A comparative case is certainly something that we actually included in the first draft. I think that discussing and describing the different mechanisms, the similarities between some countries and the differences with others goes a long way to illustrate the theory that we have. And there are certainly countries, and here is the question about backsliding. And for those of you who might be aware of this discussion currently in the political science world, there is no consensus that democratic backsliding necessarily has happened in the way that it has been theorized. But in Latin America, we have found that there is a consensus that some countries have undergone democratic backsliding. One of the important components of this democratic backsliding is the role of term limits and the role that the judiciary has in enabling the elimination of term limits. And here I'm gonna go to a case I'm very familiar with, which is the Bolivian case. President Morales went up for a referendum in 2016 where he asked the population whether or not he could run for a third term. He lost the referendum. He shouldn't have run for elections in 2019. However, he resorted to the Supreme Court in Bolivia, alleging that term limits violated his human rights. Of course, by this time, he had filled the judiciary with his allies, and in 2017, the court ruled in favor of Morales and against the national referendum, which is what actually led to the crisis in the country in 2019. So we're definitely thinking about what are some observable mechanisms of backsliding in terms of not just term limits, but perhaps the lack of independence between different branches of government, because that then would tell protesters, and I would say like the public at large, that there is something wrong or problematic about the political institutions, then they will be less satisfied with it, as opposed to countries where they know that even if the executive is in power for, say, longer than usual periods of time, that there are other branches of government that may keep the executive at check. But in countries where we don't see this division and we don't see this autonomy from the branches of government, then it's more likely that it is the political institutions that are compromised and therefore send a stronger signal to protesters that their interests and demands won't be met. We're certainly elaborating the cases and including them in the drafts as illustrative of the theory.
That's excellent. I'm glad to hear this. So this makes me think, and here's where my question and perhaps suggestion comes in. A long time ago now, in 2013, I published a piece in conflict management and peace science with my colleague, Dr. Sergio Bejar, on this issue, right? On the issue of IMF protests, and particular protests in Latin America. And at the time, there were mainly most of the studies were small n studies, right? And LAPOP had been going on, et cetera, but people had not kind of put a comprehensive data set on this that went for a very long time, right? So what we decided to do at the time was include a measure of democracy. So how democratic is the country? So trying to take into account this backsliding issue, of course. We included a measure of the amount of repressive protest, the repression from the government, because I had done in 2005 and before, I am part of that literature in sociology on backlash, right? On backlash to repression. So we are trying to control for that. We try to control for regional variation, and we try to control for ethnic conflict and many other measures, including dissatisfaction with IMF policies, right? So GDP, all of those measures. And what we found out is that there was still an unexplained factor left over that was negatively correlated to this. And basically, what we ended up finding is that collective actually ends up increasing by about 40%, 38% in Latin America when countries sign IMF contracts, even when controlling for most other factors. And what that meant to us is the perceived loss of legitimacy. So one of the things that you are talking about, right? In other words, it's not necessarily about the policies. It's not necessarily about, but it's about the dissatisfaction of the people with what they perceive their government is doing. Are they legitimately acting on their behalf or not? What seems interesting to me here is so I'm very much with you, and I think what we need to find then is, of course, at that time we couldn't follow up because of, like you were saying, it's incredibly difficult to actually garner large amounts of data from particular countries in particular cases. It requires too many people, in too many countries, too much money, right? But to actually conduct this. But I find fascinating that that's actually as a long-term project, one of the things that you're trying to do, and I would love to be involved and help out in whichever way I can. But here's what I find is what we need to focus on, as you're saying, is the particular mechanisms of this legitimacy perception, right, or loss of legitimacy perception. And I'm going to give you the case of perhaps it doesn't have much to do with time again, right? And you have the Uruguayan case, in Latin America. But let me just put the case right now in the United States. It doesn't have to do absolutely anything with the amount of time the U.S. keeps being in their monotonous bipartisan pattern of, a few years Republicans are in power, a few years Democrats are in power, and it's the classic dichotomy, and it keeps continuing like that. But protests have increased, dissatisfaction with the system has increased, et cetera, et cetera. So I think another important variable here, and I had a blog post in Mobilization several years ago with another colleague that's now in an Australian university, Raul Sanchez Uribarri, where we talked about perhaps measuring some instances of the legislative branch and of the judicial system as proxies for this. In other words, as proxies for how do we account for a system that's actually backsliding? It perhaps not necessarily time, like you were saying. There's cases where the time is not a perfect proxy, the US, Uruguay, etc. But it might be one, right? One of multiple. But perhaps rulings of the Supreme Court in decisive cases, right? And coding those as, is this a way in which we can measure that democracy is being strengthened, or is it backsliding? In other words, is the Supreme Court, just siding with the government in turn in clear rulings that seem absolutely anti-democratic, right? That's one way that we thought about it. And the other way of thinking about this, I think, in trying to form a more complex index, is the legislative branch, right? How many times does the legislative branch support or does not support the actual mandates of the party system in place? which would be another. Again, both of these are difficult to do, but perhaps less difficult than going to the countries and asking the protesters about it. It might just be using text analysis techniques to go through a lot of different legislations and Supreme Court decisions. So what do you think about those possibilities?
So then my first thought, especially the reason why we chose, for example, term limits. So our measure of time is not necessarily an indicator of backsliding, because certainly we have countries that, as you mentioned, have been for a long time and are not necessarily cases of concern in terms of backsliding. We're thinking about time in terms of a political renewal. It might be that protesters and citizens are not necessarily dissatisfied because they see an observable signal of democratic erosion, but rather because they're simply tired that the same people are in government. And there is this lack of political renewal. Certainly the US is a case in point, that the candidates for both political parties are nobody new, can be a strong signal about the actual political opportunities for competition in these countries. But that doesn't really say anything about democratic backsliding. It's just that there's nothing renewing in the country in terms of politics. Now, that on one hand, about the measures of the judiciary, one of the reasons we chose term limits, for example, is that for us it signals it's observable for the population. It's a relevant, salient topic that citizens can immediately see and observe and make assessments based on that. With the judiciary and the rulings, I would wonder how many of these the population knows about or would know about, for them to actually make assessments based on that and on those. My guess is that with high stake cases, this would be true. This would be televised and people would know and there would be a reaction to that. But I would wonder how many of these cases in a subsample would actually be observable by the population to make these kinds of assessments.
I bet, but I don't. But we don't know, right?
So
that's the beauty of the data. That I think we need to get. I bet that because of what you showed in your previous slides, where the people that are more engaged in protests also tend to be more involved in the political arena. In other words, they tend to vote. They probably follow the importance of all of these things. They would be very aware. I'm not sure if the general population, but the ones that are protesting would be very aware.
Certainly, yeah, okay, yeah. This is, The one thing data-wise that I would say about the data collection on the judiciary rulings, I wonder what the variation for collecting this data in Latin America is. Just going from just thinking about like collecting documents in Bolivia and Ecuador and how difficult that has been. Definitely like a big data collection effort here.
It will be. And when I wrote this blog post with Dr. Sanchez Uribarri, what we were focusing on only, just as a case study, was the many, which is IMF related too, by the way, so in different countries, when the bottom, the bottom fell out of the housing market, and the way that the judiciary reacted to this, right? So this happened in Mexico, it happened in Venezuela, it happened in Argentina, it happened in many Latin American countries before it happened actually in the United States, right? And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court in many of these countries reacted in different ways. So we had variation. And so the case of the Barzón in Mexico, for example, right, where people actually created a community to try to protest that the actual government and the Supreme Court had actually sided on this on the side of the government and said, well, no, you that's it, you're done. You lost your house, right? In Venezuela, there was a little bit of a different response. In Argentina, there was so I agree with you. I think it would be really difficult to do this in a large. but maybe this is kind of like supplemental data for case studies. In particular, so we have that one instance of a very similar case with very similar circumstances in many Latin American countries. So at least that would be a beginning.
No, these are great ideas. Again, we in trying to illustrate the theory and provide as much evidence as we can. This is definitely, and will definitely be easier also than getting these big grants to get these big surveys, sample representative surveys into 4 different countries. So this is.
I mean, I hope that you can still do that, to be honest. We need it. We need to figure out the mechanisms of these, right? I mean, we have been for decades going at this. Many of us that explore these issues of democratization, of protesting, etc., with this large data that's mainly based on either self-reporting on newspapers or etc. And we really need to do better to try to figure out those mechanisms for this loss of legitimacy issue. At the same time, it takes an enormous undertaking. So please don't. I want to encourage you to continue that. It's just going to take a long time, I think. So that's. But please, that is one thing that we do need too. So don't stop.
Don't worry. We already started. We're at the point where like we already started. Might as well keep going.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Okay, I don't want to monopolize this, so I have another question from other participants. Kai McKinney asks, given that protesters are more likely to engage in activities like voting, is there a way of measuring the extent to which people who engage in collective action believe that positive change is even possible under current political regimes versus people who choose to politically disengage?
Okay, so let me try to, that's like a big question. Empirically, an interesting question, and hopefully I'm going to answer this correctly. I think that the closest way that we can get to that in terms of data and measuring in LAPOP, and again, I've been working with LAPOP for a long time. I know there are other data sets, but there are questions in these surveys that ask assessments of the population in terms of if they think that the government is going after their interests, is in fact representing their interests. I think the newest waves are also asking citizens about other forms of political participation. So for example, and there is, in other projects that I work with Crew, who is part of this project as well, in studying civil society, we actually measure the different kinds of engagement that citizens have. And so for us, the easiest way to do that, and we have another index for this, is kind of putting together citizens who have reported doing many things, from voting, contacting public officials, signing petitions, participating in protests, to citizens who have reported doing none. So one way of measuring political apathy, I would say, or disengagement, would be to identify for us in the data individuals who have reported engaging in none of these activities. Again, this is where we get that protesters. I showed you the data for elections and voting, because I think this is a very important part of political participation that is institutionalized. But this is also true for protesters who are more likely to do other things like contacting government officials, signing petitions, starting campaigns, a bunch of things in terms of political participation. If I remember correctly, our sample of protesters has engaged at least in one other activity, where we certainly have citizens who haven't protested and also have not engaged in any other kind of political participation. I mean, this is what makes protesters interesting, especially empirically. They protest, but they certainly have tried other means. It's not that they necessarily have gone to protest as a first instance, but a protest is not necessarily mutually exclusive with other forms of political participation. It is complementary to these more institutionalized forms. But all of our protesters have engaged in at least one other form of political participation. That's why we don't think these are people that are apathetic to politics. It is our non-protesters who have in the table, we've seen that they don't necessarily engage in anything, including protests. It would be interesting to see here. I'm thinking about the new research idea is always so more shining than the process that we are doing. But I'm starting to wonder now our research questions about protesters and non-protesters. But it would certainly be interesting to know and understand better levels of satisfaction with the political system. Thinking about the subset of non-protesters as more heterogeneous, say people who have voted but not protester, people who have engaged with civil society organizations but not necessarily protested, and what are the effects of that, or the effects of, say, time in office or backsliding into the evaluations of these citizens, certainly. And those citizens who have also chose to not engage at all.
Yeah,
hopefully I responded.
no, I think you did, and I think what actually would be even more interesting, just giving you more ideas, even also more interesting to think about is so speaking about over time, right? So because a lot of my work is I do event history analysis, so I try to follow people over time, and when and why and how, of course, do people that were engaged, civically engaged in whatever of these behaviors, it doesn't matter, right? Anywhere from voting to civic engagement. When and if, why and how do they become politically disengaged? And I think that is so the opposite, right? That is fascinating, and that's something that I don't know how many people have focused on, but that would be a fascinating. Of course, again, it would need a longitudinal follow-up of people, and that's as we know, that's difficult and expensive to do, but it would be fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, I would love to be able to follow and have like a panel, like complete panel data for protesters themselves, but LAPOP actually doesn't ask the same people, right, if they protested or not.
Yeah, panel data, that's our curse. I mean, it's also great, right? Because in the absence of that, we would have nothing. There's in another piece that I wrote with Dr. Ostertag, we did a small case study of civically engaged bloggers after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things that's interesting that we found, of course, like you are mentioning, is that most protesters are highly civically engaged people. They have tried many other ways to participate, right? Including protesting. And I think, both in the literature of social movements and in sociology and in political science, we don't pay too much attention to that. Civic engagement is a spectrum, right, of behaviors. And those of us like me that focus on protest, we tend to focus on protest or voting, or right. And then there's other people that tend to focusing on civic engagement. Like I go to my kids' board of education meetings, but we forget that these are the same people the majority of the times, and that these behaviors are highly correlated. And I wonder if there's a enough correlation between, and this is exactly why I mentioned the thing with the courts and all of this, because these people are highly political, and being highly political means you do follow all of these things. This is concerning to you. You're engaged, right? So it'll be interesting to figure out. Maybe there's other proxies for other types of civic engagement that demonstrate this. Anyway, I have another question here. It says, "Thank you for your presentation. And thank you, Claps, for organizing this. I noticed that in one of your early graphs, you demonstrated that dissatisfaction increased following the global economic collapse of 2007. Is there a relationship between government policies, court rulings that privilege corporations, and INF policy over individual citizens and increased dissatisfaction?
Okay, this is let me see if I can actually go back to that graph. If I maybe sure, maybe this, no. Maybe this one. Okay, so yeah, dissatisfaction increased after 2007. This question actually makes me think of your earlier comment, David, in terms of IMF policies. Here, I'm going to separate a little bit like rulings and IMF policies and dissatisfaction with the political system, because you in fact have a little bit of a different reading that we did in terms of this dissatisfaction being geared towards these specific policies, perhaps the specific administrations. But if we are thinking about this signaling to citizens that governments are siding with corporations instead of their interests, then this is something about the political institutions themselves, not necessarily just about the policy or not. In this study in particular, to kind of answer the question, we don't include anything to account for economic policies. We control for income and wealth, but we don't. I would be curious if I add a dummy variable to say before and after 2007 and see what I find there. I don't know what I would find, but it makes me think a little bit more about policies and the scope of some policies and how this might become observable signal to citizens about the representativeness of the political system versus other policies that are less observable and have less of an impact on the citizenry. We don't include that, in fact, in this project. We don't zoom in into this. But I think that, and going along with the idea that you have, perhaps looking at rulings, it's important. Again, I would have to think a little bit more about whether or not, what this signals. Is it really signaling? I don't necessarily think it's signaling in every instance, say, democratic backsliding as such, as we've been conceptualizing. But it is clearly signaling a misalignment between the government actions and the interests of the population versus vis-a-vis other international organizations. To me, this addresses something a little bit different in terms of legitimacy, because we've been thinking about legitimacy in terms of democratic procedures. And I think this is what my work really is speaking to, legitimacy in terms of democratic procedures and how these are then shown to citizens or perceived by citizens. But the IMF court rulings wouldn't necessarily be pointing to democratic practices, because you could have elections that are held, would say, freely and fairly, but in between these elections, then we have these court rulings and these policies that are not representing the general will of the public. And so those were two different mechanisms. And now you're piquing my interest into these other alternative explanations that are certainly not included in the project, because our focus and the emphasis that we are trying to do here is really in these democratic processes. But again, it might actually not be the democratic processes themselves, but other things that the government is doing. And here I would even add this latest wave of citizens electing presidents that are these spoken anti-system. Milei is the more recent example in Latin America. Elections were free and fair, competition was there. One of the things that citizens responded to as a driver to voting for Milei is to be tired of these traditional elites that I would say in their minds also side with big corporations, with international organizations, and not necessarily their interests. Definitely a viable mechanism to pursue. No, we don't do it in this project, but I'm starting to think that perhaps we should at least account for that in terms of and in terms of categorizing Latin American countries and where they fall in this spectrum of, is it democratic backsliding or is it clearly something else? To be also to add something here. The level of trust and engagement that citizens have with political parties, which is the main connection that they have to the political establishment, it's on the floor for many Latin American countries. Citizens don't trust political parties. And so this might also kind of speak a little bit to this more traditional, people are tired of politics as usual, precisely perhaps because politics as usual means the representation of other interests rather than the citizenry. Definitely a question that I cannot answer fully here, but something that I'll consider and think about as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that's and that is exactly what we were thinking, right? When we wrote that piece, and it was like, it doesn't necessarily, because we accounted for a level of democracy, and it seems like there's two levels to this, right? I think you're right. There is a system, a political system, democratic backslide effect. I wouldn't doubt it. And then there's a lower system, which is, like you were saying, trust in the erosion of other types of legitimacy, not necessarily tied to democracy in the classic ways that we think about it, like you have free elections, but that are perhaps more about the systematic inequalities that are types of democracy that we've had in the 20th and 21st century have led to, right? Which in other words is, well, on paper, the separation of powers is there. On paper, we can vote. On paper, all of these things are happening, and I'm still like really poor, and I can see that this legislation and all of these policies are going to benefit these other people, and I'm not getting it. I'm not advancing, right? And so I think there's two levels. So I think you're onto something there, and I think it would be very, very interesting to include it there too, if you can. Anyway, this is a beautiful topic, and you have years and years and years of amazing research to come. So I am hopefully I will be following it, and I will love to read it, and hopefully we can collaborate on some of these things. So Dr. Jimena Velasco, yeah, Dr. Jimena Velasco Huachaya, we ran out of time, but I really want to thank you for an incredibly engaging talk, really fascinating topic, and brilliant future of lots of different questions for research for our region. So muchas gracias. Thank you. I also want to thank everyone who participated in our speaker series and that were present here for Dr. Velasco's talk. I want to remind you that we have this speaker series of classes the last Wednesday of every month. So we will have another one in March, and our next speaker is Dr. Jeremy Slack. So we'll hope to see you there. Again, I was honored to have you, Dr. Velasco Huachaya. Thank you so much. And I hope this is not the last time we talk, because we have a lot to discuss.
Indeed. Thank you so much for having me. Again, an excellent platform to talk about the research, ideas, and moving forward. And I'll definitely look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. Gracias a todos. Nos vemos a la próxima.
Bye.